Now, as you likely know, we've been celebrating our 10th anniversary of the School of Theology and Ministry throughout this academic year. And as we conclude the celebration this evening, we're taking a look not so much at the past, but at the future of theological education, kind of what it may look like over the next 10 years or so. I'm pleased to introduce to you the panelists that will be presenting, all of whom are on the faculty at School of Theology and Ministry. And each one will speak from his or her own area of expertise: Bible, historical theology, morality, practical theology, and systematics. I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they will speak, and then just allow them to speak. So first is Andrew Davis, who earned the PhD from Johns Hopkins University. Andrew is originally from Raleigh, North Carolina, and is Associate Professor of Old Testament. His research interests include literary approaches and historical method in the biblical narrative, prophetic literature, feminist approaches to the Old Testament, ancient Israelite religion, and the book of Job. Brian Dunkle, S.J., grew up in Freeport, New York, and is Assistant Professor of Historical Theology. He holds the STB from the Gregorian University of Rome and the STL from Boston College School of Theology and Ministry, and then his PhD is from Notre Dame. We like to diversify a little bit. Brian's area of interest and expertise include 4th century Christology and Trinitarian theology, Ambrose of Milan, the Cappadocians and Augustine, early Christian hymns and poetry, and nature and grace in early Christianity. Mary Jo Iozzio is professor of moral theology. She earned her doctorate from Fordham University. Mary Jo her work focuses on fundamental moral theology, Catholic social ethics, feminist ethics, virtue ethics, and theological ethics. In the area of social justice, she has a special interest in disability studies, anti-racism, and access to health, education, and economic stability. Colleen Griffith holds a doctorate in theology from Harvard Divinity School and serves as professor of the practice of theology and director of our spirituality studies. Historical contemporary spirituality, theological anthropology with a concentration on a theology and spirituality of the body, method in theology, constructive theology, practical theology. Those are all the focuses that Colleen brings to her research and teaching. And finally, at the end is Dominic Doyle. Dominic was born in London, England, and is Associate Professor of Systematic Theology. A graduate of Cambridge University in England and Harvard, he earned the PhD from Boston College. Dominic's area of interest include theological anthropology, the theology of culture, and the doctrine of God, particularly Thomas Aquinas and Karl Rahner. Now, obviously, to talk about the theological education over the next 10 years is a daunting task. And clearly, there are present and emerging trends that shape society and the church, which must be taken into account when we engage in theological education. Now, these can be perceived as either positive or negative trends. For example, we can speak of the rise of diversity as both a positive and as a challenge. We can speak of the contribution of the Latino-Latina population in church and society. Or we can point to the growing awareness of the need for accountability and transparency within the church and other institutions. Those are just some of the diverse dynamics and trends that are impacting our society and our church. All of these are important, and they're important to the way in which we do theology. And while recognizing that we cannot do theological education and ignore these trends, whether they be gifts or challenges or probably a little of both, the lens we're picking up tonight is different. It's looking at the trends and the movements and the themes that shape theology itself, and more specifically still, the theology as expressed in the subdisciplines of the people on the panel. Theological education, particularly as it's done in the School of Theology and Ministry, is fundamentally in service to the church and ultimately to our world. Even what sometimes seems to be obscure has as the deep question behind it that the Christian theologian asks, how do we more adequately teach and ultimately live out the reality of God's love expressed in Jesus. That's what we're all about. So that while we're focusing here on the theological themes, we recognize that those are impacted by the culture around us. So with those remarks, on to the panel. Each person has about 10 minutes, and I've got a clock, followed by a brief time for conversation among yourselves, and then question and response from the panelists. So without further ado, Andrew?
Thank you, Jane. I want to first thank you, Jane, and thank Continuing Education for this opportunity to predict the future in biblical studies. I thought as a way to start my remarks, I might read to you from 4 job descriptions that came up on the biblical studies job market in the last 2 years. Not because I'm on the job market or plan on leaving. If there's anything about biblical studies at BC in the next 10 years, I plan to be here for those 10 years and see what I got right and what I got wrong. But I thought job descriptions of recent job postings would be an interesting way to identify what I see as an emerging trend in the field. So this is from a recent New Testament posting this past year at Columbia Theological Seminary, asking for a candidate to engage in research and writing in New Testament and biblical studies, which may include subspecialities or interdisciplinary work in such fields as mujerista, womanist, feminist interpretation, disability studies, queer theory, minoritized hermeneutics, or post-colonial studies. And a job posting from Santa Clara University in Old Testament, quote, in addition to firm grounding in traditional methods of interpretation, applicants with facility in such approaches as literary, cultural, post-colonial, feminist criticisms of texts, and the ability to teach all levels of Hebrew are invited to apply. At Holy Cross, just down the road from us, they ask for, we particularly welcome candidates with contemporary methodological frameworks such as post-colonial, ecological, critical race theory, or feminist approaches. And the last one from Yale Divinity School for Hebrew Bible 2 years ago, preference will be given to candidates who can effectively engage with post-historical critical approaches, such as but not limited to feminist, post-colonial, and literary interpretation. And I think what these 4 examples highlight, I'm sure you can already tell, is that there's a real interest in biblical studies, I think, in what we might call contextual approaches. And I think the language I just read from these job descriptions, I don't think you would have seen in job descriptions maybe 10 years ago. And so I think to my friends who are still on the job market, this has been something that they've noticed, and I think it's reflective of a larger trend within biblical studies, which is that there's a shift away from, I'd say, focusing on the historical context of the biblical authors who produce the biblical text, and a shift in focus to the contexts of different communities who have received the biblical text, and especially communities whose perspectives have been marginalized in the history of interpretation. And so that, in my opinion, is the biggest trend going on right now in biblical studies. And I see this trend increasing in the next 10 years as more and more communities whose perspective has been left out are being brought into the mainstream and in some ways into the center. And I think that this trend represents a great opportunity for the field of biblical studies, but I would say there's also a big risk here. And the risk is that biblical studies, because of this new development, I think is becoming bifurcated. And so on one side, you have scholars who are trained in historical critical methodology and are interested in exploring the historical linguistic background of the biblical authors who produce the biblical text. On the other hand, are these scholars who are more interested in the context in which the biblical text is received. And the risk here, I think, is that those 2 groups of scholars don't often enough talk to each other. And in some ways, this is a product of graduate programs in biblical studies, that you really, programs either specialize in one or the other of these types of scholarships. And so you're producing scholars, professors of Bible, who are able to do one and not the other. And so in my opinion, this is the biggest challenge facing the field of biblical studies for the next 10 years, is will this gap continue to widen in biblical studies where 2 approaches to the Bible will essentially be developing on parallel tracks that don't intersect, or will our field find ways to bridge this gap? And what I want to say about the future of biblical studies at BCSTM is that I'm actually hopeful that BCSTM can play an integral role in being one of those bridge builders. And that's because our Bible faculty at STM are all trained in historical critical methodology and are all specialists, I'd say, in knowing the historical context, linguistic context of the biblical authors. And yet, by the fact that we're at a school of theology and ministry, all the work that we're doing is contextual. And so for us, it's not an either or, but we're trained in the historical critical methodology, but we're teaching students who are going out to work in pastoral settings. And so everything we're doing is oriented towards the sort of communities of faith who are ultimately going to receive this text. And so for me, I'm hopeful of the role that BCSTM can play in both developing fields of biblical studies and hopefully being part of the bridge and not contributing to the further division within the field. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Brian.
Thank you, and thanks for organizing us again. Andrew's going to show me up at least, both in the brevity of his remarks and in his doing it off the cuff. It's pretty impressive. But a lot of what he mentioned certainly will resonate with my understanding or my experience in the field of history of Christianity. So I begin with a bit of a caution, because I study texts and periods that are over 1,500 years old. When I am given to prophesy about the next 10 years, my expectations are pretty modest. And I'd say if I consulted most of my colleagues in the history area, we'd find that the syllabi we were using 10 years ago are a lot like the syllabi we're using today. Now, tweaking and adapting each year, especially in response to scholarly trends, but realizing that there's an important body of literature that we ought to be returning to, a perennial relevance. But I do want to talk about some trends in the field that were hinted at by Andrew, but I'm going to build on a bit when I talk about this related area of discipline, or really disciplinary area of historical theology and church history, which informs how we teach everything from the development of Christological doctrine to women doctors of the church to our core surveys in the history of Christianity. Now, my area of specialization, typically labeled patristics, has this division, or maybe you say distinction, arise even discussion in the discussion of the name of the field. We refer to, when we use the term patristics, we refer to the fathers of the church, which can seem remarkably out of date, and not just because of the kind of patriarchal resonance, but in fact, more importantly, and I think this is shared among scholars in the field, the idea that these are fathers in the sense of authorities, that these are authorities. So there are many scholars in this field who have no vested commitment in seeing St. Athanasius or St. Augustine or St. Basil as fathers, having this kind of role. And they would even argue that by treating them as such, you can't remain objective scientifically. You can't be honest and critical about their teaching in a scholarly way. And yet, the enduring power of this paradigm shows up in a variety of ways, but especially in the very name of my guild, which is the North American Patristic Society. There have been some debates about the name, primarily because it's acronymed NAPS. And whether you think that's... but it sticks. We'll see in a few years. It's under debate. Yeah. So at the heart of this history, theology sort of distinction is, I think, a necessary balance that I hope we can preserve at the STM. As historical theologians or as historians of Christianity, you have to both learn about the central figures in Christian history, but we're also expected to learn from them, about versus from. So in my field, scholars generally prioritize one of these two approaches. Some, those who are historical or even contextual historians, subject to scientific probing and analysis the majors in texts from the early Christian period and from what's known as late antiquity. They're often correcting traditional views of church history, which can be biased by confessional or apologetic motives, in order to rethink narratives about the beliefs and methods and the reception of these great major figures in the past. So in this line, you'd find scholars more inclined to locate the dark side of Augustine's legacy, or to focus on the political rather than the purely scriptural or theological explanations for some of his famous arguments, for instance, predestination. And some of the trends come up in the way that scholars have moved away from traditional analyses of basic theological controversies through the centuries. You might think of Arianism, to focus more on the idea of identity formation. So they suggest that sort of orthodoxy developed only as a chance to kind of shore up a group identity, to distinguish our crowd from that crowd, rather than because of any enduring philosophical or theological commitments. And again, here we'd have the enduring relevance of critical theory in today's academy. Now, on the other hand, more theologically inclined scholars, and I'd include myself in this camp, tend to treat the ideas and the modes of thinking of these great saints and teachers as enduring models and guides for contemporary discussions of belief. We're not denying the essential role that good, rigorous history must play in learning about the sources to determine precisely what they have to tell us in the first place. But I still think there are two develops even in this area that still look to these as sources. First, there's a realization that we have to rethink standard notions of evolution or development of doctrine in a kind of linear unfolding of a process. And second, there is a much greater attention to marginal sources, sort of unattended voices that may have been lost through the centuries, especially voices that don't survive in the mainstream languages, at least mainstream for me, of Greek and Latin. So I think theologians are more critical or questioning of views of the history of doctrine on ideas like the two natures of Christ, or the definition of the Trinity as three persons sharing one essence, that they're kind of inevitable conclusions of a standard and steady process. Rather, they look to find voices that may have been lost or kind of even considered dead ends in early Christian discussions, to see what they might shed on theological discussion today. So, for instance, one of my favorite theologians, St. Gregory of Nazianzus, likes to talk about how we're united to Christ, and he uses the philosophical language of mixture. It's blending. Now, it's language that was abandoned when everybody wanted to draw a sharp division between creator and created, but maybe it's worth recovering, understood in a proper way, to shed light on how we get to so intimate a union. Now, second, theologians are more deeply taken with the approaches of minority traditions, especially from areas like Syria and Ethiopia, where we have tons of texts that survive but are very often not translated because we don't know the languages or people don't study them as much. And they employ distinctive theological language, generally more symbolic, you might say, than philosophical, and that's sort of in vogue in itself, and it's been underappreciated. So histories of doctrine that are more global, kind of global histories, and there's one in particular by Robert Wilkin called The First 1,000 Years. They call attention to these marginal voices. So on either front, whether more properly historical or more properly theological, there's a lot of work to be done, and the scholarly landscape will shift, if not change radically in 10 years, and so are syllabi. But I do want to point us to one particular challenge in historical theology that we have to identify. I think the backgrounds of our students are going to raise challenges for assumptions that we traditionally make about what students come with. Well, I think in previous generations, professors teaching in graduate programs could presume something like general education, especially in a Western tradition, which we inevitably favor in tracing the history of doctrine. That's just not the case, except in limited instances. Liberal arts programs are closing down. Humanities programs, like for instance, recently at Wheeling Jesuit University, are kind of shoring up to become more focused on STEM and professional training. And in the process, we've got students coming, I think, with much better sensitivity to issues of critical thinking and hidden biases, but often without the kind of global historical training that we may have presumed previously. So I put on a prophetical hat to say that we'll have to balance this concern to learning about the sources with a learning from them, always ready to rethink received narratives on the basis of new evidence and new perspectives. But of course, at the SDM, we've got the special challenge, the special call to see how both of those processes are related to ministry, kind of relating to training our students to serve and to bring this wisdom accumulated through centuries to the service of those in need and those who need to hear Christ's voice. Thank you.
So, as with others, thank you for the invitation. Thank you all for your attendance here with us this evening. Yes, we are not wearing the prophecy or the prophet's hats and looking into the future, the seers, but we're doing the best that we can, knowing where we started and where we are today. I could venture to say that each one of us has grown quite a bit from the days when we were in graduate school. And the body of literature that's available has likewise grown. More than any one scholar could read is now produced in all of our disciplines. So, moral theology, a living tradition in transition is the way I'm framing my comments. Over the last 50 years or more, the discipline of moral theology has burgeoned from its enclaves in seminaries and monastic houses of study and perhaps houses of religious formation with a fairly homogeneous student body and a fairly homogeneous set of faculty members. The discipline is now present in both private and public colleges and universities with far more heterogeneous student and faculty populations. As you can tell from the panel, right here, we have among us only one person who is a vowed religious. The other four of us are lay persons engaged in theological work. It's fairly new, both in moral theology and all of the theological disciplines. So, what had been an almost uniform dominant male postulant or cleric composition of persons interested in the field of moral theology to now laymen and laywomen, to persons of minority communities, and to the gender diversity in our consciousness now more broadly, this is the change that happens not only in the discipline, but in the discipline's subject matter. This shift has influenced the ways that the tradition is taught, or traditions are taught, the materials that we professors use, and the audiences that the discipline now reaches. So it's not just, as it had been in seminary formation, for the purposes of, you studied moral theology for all intents and purposes, to learn how to conduct confessional and penitential services for the faithful, in a Catholic setting anyway. It's a very exciting time in the Guild, and for some, it's more than a little dangerous to be in moral theology, especially for those who dare to delve into subject matter that questions time-bound conclusions that have been pronounced by the Church's teaching authority. We can probably recall a few times the silencing of some theologians. Of recent memory, Elizabeth Johnson in systematic theology was called to cease and desist with some of her work in systematic theology, and Margaret Farley was called to cease and desist her work in sexual morality, a moral theologian writing on sexual morality. Both women religious. So the Church has at some level tentacles that can reach to women religious, where lay women and lay men have a little more freedom to speak and to write and to teach, as those ecclesial authorities can only speak then to their deans and or presidents to request silence. So historical consciousness has been key to a shift in moral theology from a focus on particular acts. Is this sin or not sin? How grave a sin is this? What penance ought I to do to repent? We've moved from that singular focus, or what had been a somewhat singular focus, to an appreciation of moral agency more broadly. The whats and the whys and the hows of what moral agents do. Every single one of us is a moral agent. And what we do is our expression of moral agency, our freedom to do X, Y, or Z thing, given the parameters of our being raised in certain cultures and what rules we have decided to abide and what to disobey. Members of the Guild in moral theology likewise recognize the multiple contexts in which formation of moral agency, or the lack thereof, has become determinative of a moral agent's freedom to do and to be as she or he wishes to become in their best sense of future determination, self-determination. This awareness of context is critical for the field and will remain critical for the field insofar as we begin to recognize more and more the differences between, for example, privilege and a lack thereof. So change in this awareness of context has unfolded relatively quickly in the scheme of the discipline that can trace its start to the literature of the penitential period, the penitential literature of the patristic period of time, Brian's area of study, as well as Andrew's area of study, where we have prescriptions in Scripture to direct us. So we've gone from penitential literature of the patristic period to the medieval scholastics' Summa, Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae, for example, not the only one of the Summa that had been written in the 12th, 13th, 14th, and even into the 15th centuries, to the pre-modern development of casuistry, to the modern manuals of moral theology, again, a lot of that being confessional literature in general. That's 18th to 19th centuries of development. 18th to 19th centuries, that's 1,800, 1,900 years from the start of what could be called the discipline to today, right? So in the last 100 years, the discipline has changed dramatically. For many of the reasons that I mentioned in my opening remarks, now there are lay persons in the field, and the discipline has moved out of, still remains in the seminaries, but has moved beyond seminary instruction to the wider public, and a professional guild of ethicists has emerged. So in less than 100 years, the discipline has broken free, we can almost say, from the boundaries that were set by ecclesial structures and authoritative directives for the benefit of the faithful. Has broken free because the faithful are similarly more educated than the laity had been previously. Right? So as lay persons went to university, some of those persons, such as myself and others in the room, have engaged with the theological disciplines. This is relatively new. Nevertheless, the discipline remains concerned with the search for truth, for the moral truth, whatever that might mean, that's attentive to today's contexts, and that is expressed rather differently today than it was in the past. But it's the same insights, the same interest in looking for what is the right thing to do here. So while the academic discipline has moved from confessional utterances to sin no more and to avoid the near occasion of sin, to forming consciences, that formation requires examination of the contexts and the structures that contribute to or thwart human flourishing for the moral agent herself or himself and the ecclesial, educational, institutional, political, and social milieu in which each agent is to thrive. Now, in the last 50 years, the discipline has moved from those seminaries and universities to other settings beyond strictly academic instruction to an application. This is going to continue. Application of professional ethics, of moral theology, philosophical ethics to hospital ethics committees, for example, research universities and research protocols. How will we treat the subjects of our research? Corporate boards, for-profit and non-profit institutions, professional societies. I see a couple of my colleagues here in the room. There is, in the United States alone, the Society of Christian Ethics, the Catholic Theological Society of America, which has a group dedicated to moral theology. There's the College Theology Society, which has a group dedicated to moral theology. And the American Academy of Religion, kind of a zoo for all, has multiple sessions dedicated to the subject matter of theological ethics, religious ethics, of all religions, not just the Christian faith. So, into these different places, consider, where did this come from? Why did moral theology end up in institutions, non-academic and non-seminary formation type institutions? They ended up there in many ways as a result of the Nazi pogrom against the Jewish community, where medical doctors were performing experimental procedures on the adult and children prisoners. At the Nuremberg trials, this history of experimentation, gross experimentation on unconsenting participants was exposed and rejected outright. The Nuremberg trials formed for us what has become known as the Helsinki Agreement, that we will not allow medical professionals to do this again. So it's extended from the medical professionals to all other kind of professional organizations. These protocols require assessment by persons who are trained in moral theology or philosophical or theological ethics. The reach of the discipline reminds me of the first dictum of what I like to think of as the first dictum of morality, and that is that every human act is a moral act. So everything that we do has moral value, positive or negative. Very few things that we do are neutral. They either will have positive or negative value in the scheme of a moral evaluation or assessment of the action. So it's fairly clear that the discipline has plenty of material about which to opine. The concerns of the 20th century ethics committees' needs will continue and have continued into the 21st century. As the 21st century unfolds, we find ourselves facing new questions in search of answers that will protect human flourishing more broadly. Perhaps you read the op-ed in today's Globe by Bill McKibben called "The Clock Keeps Ticking in the Fight to Save the Planet," following the alarm that Rachel Carson sounded in 1962 in her text, The Silent Spring, and perhaps even before that with Teilhard de Chardin and his work in cosmic consciousness, we could call it, I suppose. Environmental sustainability is a critical concern in moral theology and many other disciplines. As many members of the Guild are laypersons, the discipline has entered also an open engagement with concerns regarding family planning, intergenerational family care, household budgeting matters, as well as concerns for our sisters and brothers relegated to the margins and or oppressed as a result of inequality and outright poverty. Similarly, scholars recognize a positive and critical array of gender and sexual diversity, as well as the intersections of race, culture, and disability. Attention to global realities have taken center stage in Catholic circles, especially with the development of a global network of scholars through the Catholic Theological Ethics in the World Church. These initiatives of CTEWC, for lack of spelling it out every time, these initiatives I lost myself. of international and regional the initiatives of this organization of international and regional meetings, scholarships, and a monthly newsletter are read by over 100 people, are filled with contributions from new and emerging scholars, as well as scholars who have been in the field for decades. For many of the people that our students are reading are involved as well in Catholic theological ethics. And our younger scholars are involved in Catholic theological ethics in the world church. Thus, while the contours of the discipline have been enlarged in response to contemporary needs and challenges, the sources, coupled with scientific and other disciplines specific data, again, this is the intersectionality that's coming up, remain stable. The tradition of moral theology, the discipline of moral theology, I believe will always hold fast to what is often known as the Wesleyan quadrilateral, that is scripture, tradition, reasoning about what needs to be done, and experience. Thank you.
Good evening, and it's great to see so many familiar faces out there. Thank you for coming. I'm going to make a practical theological move right now, a very bodily oriented one. Without leaving your spot in place, could we just all stand? We're a large panel, and we've gone over 30 minutes so far. So let's just stand and stretch for a minute. Thank you. I'm very happy to speak this evening about the standpoint of practical theology. You know, it's a younger discipline with respect to its appearance in the academy. And yet, practical theology today stands as an academic discipline with substantive international scope. It's the focus of several scholarly journals. It's a growing choice of study within university doctoral programs. And Catholic practical theologians have become significant voices within this field, making contributions from European, Asian, African, Australian, North and South American contexts. Practical theology, or PT as it's referenced often, is an umbrella term under which one finds a wide variety of offerings: contextual theologies, pastoral theologies, praxis-based theologies, public theologies. Whatever the stripe, practical theologians share in common some core commitments that are evident in the work being done by these theologians. 4 of these major commitments are, firstly, a commitment to the study of the realm of practice, personal and communal practices of lived faith, consideration of these as theological carriers. For practical theologians, the realm of practice is not that of application of theory, but rather a bona fide realm of knowing unto itself that becomes a very important resource in the doing of theology. Practical theologians look to the embodied practices of lived faith, those of individual persons and communities of faith, alongside of texts, and view these practices as part of the noetic content of the Christian tradition, as resource material to be drawn upon and studied. Second commitment of practical theology. Practical theology stays keenly aware of contextual dynamics in the doing of theology, considering plural contexts in which faith gets practiced, paying attention to the socio-ecclesial cultural standpoints of those engaged in practices of faith and those of the researchers, the theologian himself, and to aspects of the situatedness of praxis, including gender, race, sexuality, class, power dynamics, geography, landscape, etc. A third core commitment. Practical theology is committed to interdisciplinarity. It attempts to read and describe and interpret the realm of practice, all the while engaging central Christian claims, and knows that this requires thick description that is often served well by the incorporation of an interpretive lens from a further discipline, be that social science, natural science, neuroscience, psychology, economics, political science, not all of these, of course, but a further discipline judiciously chosen for its help in interpreting more fully the practice, the situation, the claim at hand, the people. Practical theologians see benefit in boundary crossing, in purposeful interdisciplinary zigzagging, and do not favor what's been named, quote, gated communities of discourse. A fourth core commitment of practical theologians. Practical theologians do their theology in the service of life, the church, and the world. Practical theologians, keeping the lives and struggles of real people in view, bring ethical and spiritual imagination to their work, and always have an expressed emancipatory interest. There is what one of my colleagues, Bill Rosenbaum, likes to call a liberative edge evident in the aims of practical theologians. I like to say that practical theologians are forever lobbyers with respect to the work that they do. They seek more than understanding. They wish to effect specific change. Now, in recent years, leading to the place that we sit today, practical theologians have worked hard to identify shared core commitments operative in the discipline. In the next 10 years, in my humble view, practical theology will want to be mindful of the following, and I have 4 points here. Firstly, having shown a lot of leadership in establishing practice as itself content-full and an important locus of study, and having shown that the lived faith experiences of persons and communities provide important points of access to the sensus fidei and the sensus fidelium, the sense for the faith in people, and the sense of the faithful. Practical theology in these next 10 years will want to focus closely on hermeneutical guidelines governing the study of the practices of faith. Now, this work has already begun. It has to continue, and it will be a helpful contribution to the theological enterprise as a whole. A second thought. In recent years, the dominant dialogue partner of practical theology has been social science. Yes, psychology, education, others as well. But I think that new avenues of exploration in future years will most definitely want to include interdisciplinary conversations with the physical sciences, and very significantly with the arts. I see in our group tonight a wonderful colleague, Dr. Eileen Daly from Boston University. Thanks for joining us, Eileen, who really has attended to practical theology's conversations with artists. And that kind of dialogue has only just begun. It is a fertile area for growth. A third observation. Practical theology will need to keep ever at the forefront that it is a theological discipline. Practical theology remains theology and not, for example, sociology of religion. Theological interest and theological methodology must be evident in practical theology's study of lived faith. And hopefully, theological interest and method will be articulated by increasingly diverse voices in this field. We see, for example, how the entrance of women in theology continues to shape, shake, and move theology forward. And a fourth thought. More and more, there is cross-disciplinarity evident in PT. And we ought look forward to yet more of this. There are lots of fruitful conversational exchanges and collaborations afoot with other areas within theology. And more theologians are speaking about themselves in hybrid terms. I'm a systematician who embraces the methodology of practical theology. I'm a practical theologian who resembles in several ways a moral theologian. I'm a religious educator committed to practical theological pedagogy, etc. Which leads to my final point about the future of theological education in general. The boundaries that we have had, sometimes very hard and fast boundaries, between the major areas of theology have become much more fluid in our time. And this is healthy, holding the potential for more creative and collaborative work, and hopefully an end to hierarchical ordering of the various areas that you find sometimes in theologates and in theological education. Point of fact, interest in real-life situations, and incorporation of facts on the ground where people live must assume importance for the whole of the theological enterprise. And answering to the three publics identified by David Tracy, namely the academy, the church, and the world, is the job of all theology. Finally, interpreting Christian faith in ways that are relevant and meaningful today is really the responsibility of each and every branch of theology. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. I'm going to begin with a definition of systematics, and then on the basis of that definition, state what I think is one of the main tasks for systematics over the coming decade, and then conclude with a few areas within systematics that Americans politely call areas of growth or tension. So what is systematics? Systematics is done by hyper-organized, grumpy Thomists detached from the real world who think they have all the... Oh, sorry, reading Colleen's piece, sorry. Systematics is the study of the central claims of the faith, the doctrines, as they relate to each other and to other natural truths. And so systematics is about two things. One, about identity, the central doctrines of the faith, and two, about relevance, how these doctrines relate to other disciplines, science, economics, so on. So on the basis of that definition, we can see there are two central features, identity and relevance of belief. And I think systematics' attempt to hold these together can address one of the main challenges that will get probably even more difficult over the coming decade, and that is polarization, which is essentially when someone chooses one of these poles at the expense of the other. So, for example, an exclusive concern with identity makes someone who might be a good conservative into a preservative. Put it in a jar, and it's not that useful. No one can get at it when it's tightly closed in a jar. Or an exclusive concern with relevance makes a progressive Christian indistinguishable from their secular neighbor. And so what's the point? The church becomes an NCO with incense, kind of thing. So I think what systematics should try and do, and this is the ideal, is to show how tradition and change are not opposites, but they're closely related. And in fact, tradition is really the best wisdom of the past, answering the most difficult questions of that day. So for tradition to be alive, it has to be open to new questions, but for change to be authentic, it has to be rooted in the tradition. So I think this is the task of systematics, not to fan the flames of polarization of opposites, but to achieve some fusion of horizons, as Gadamer put it. As a direct result of this awareness that tradition and change are the rhythm of systematic inquiry, it follows that systematicians will need to bone up on their history and take some of Brian's classes. Because in a sense, ideas aren't really intelligible unless you see how they develop over time. As Khaled Anatolis' book on the Christological doctrines, or Buckley's on atheism, or David Burrell on medieval interreligious dialogue have shown, you only understand an idea when it's grasped in its development, just as a person is only understood when you get their history. It's like when I taught high school, someone said to me, when you meet the parents, a lot slots into place. So now some growth areas. I think, like with Colleen, I think interdisciplinarity is going to be one of the main areas of growth, because there's so many rapid advances in other areas of knowledge that challenge or can inform theology. I'll give 4 examples. First is ecology. Laudato Si is an obvious example that's had enormous appeal. And this crisis, if there are more decades to come, hopefully, will show us we have to rethink the notion of humanity's place in creation. So that's a lot of work to be done in there. And it's inspiring to see the papacy retrieve a sense of religious authority that's respected worldwide for its leadership. You even had all the leaders of ExxonMobil and all these oil magnates come and listen to the Pope talk on this. That's a nice change of the usual direction of lecturing. Second area is evolutionary biology, which puts even more pressure on the notion, maybe a fragile doctrine of original sin, which one colleague of mine described as a doctrine under construction. It's hard to square evolution and original sin in some ways. And more positively, evolutionary biology could give more evidence and precision to René Girard's flamboyant monomania about mimetic desire and scapegoating and all that kind of stuff. I think it gives a lot of evidence and backing to Girard's interesting take on desire. Third area, neuroscience. Negatively, I think theologians will have to try and respond to the Philistine claims of reductionism that reduces the human to mere brain functions. Semantically, neuroscience can help us shift perhaps one of our key terms in theological anthropology from the soul to the self, as we become more aware of the inextricably bodily nature of human experience. And then positively, I think neuroscience can provide a theory of the neural mediation of religious experience, how the self that we've become aware that has emerged in evolution, that's capable of rational reflection and voluntary impulse control, that self, which is an extraordinary achievement in religious experience, can be taken offline. This is Patrick McNamara's account at Boston University. In that cessation of cognitive certainty and voluntary control, we can search in these intense religious experiences through liturgy, prayer, worship, meditation, and so on. We can search for an ideal self, a different self that's better than the one we have. And hopefully we can come back online in a more cooperative, altruistic, pro-social self. It seems to me that theories like this, the non-reductionist accounts of neuroscience and religious experience, can provide a cross-cultural point of comparison between different religious traditions that can inform the project of comparative theology. Perhaps another area, if we had time, a sixth figure could talk about that. But in any case, there are all these different areas of knowledge. But I think systematic theology wants to say that however much we focus on this or that area, this regional anthropology, this sectional interest, it's important, despite the intellectual fashion industry, to remember that Christianity does have a grand narrative. And any withdrawal into this or that area is for the sake of return. And we should attempt to express the unity of human knowledge. How it is that what we learn in politics or economics or philosophy or literature or natural sciences or history, they all together grow from the same theological stem, and that they can all be bearers of the good news. And that's the nature of the good news itself, that nothing is left untouched. The fourth area is ecclesiology, what it means to be church. How does grace look like when it's experienced together? It's given by a group and it's shared and grows as a group. And it seems to me this area of ecclesiology is perhaps the biggest growth area and also the most acute tension within systematics. First off is the obvious issue of what is the social context in which the church tries to preach and even tries to exist. And I think the more we understand that, the more we can respond to the privatization of faith. I'm spiritual, not religious, or I don't like organized religion, which is someone quipped, do you want disorganized religion? And if the church is a hospital, would you want a disorganized hospital? So it's what are the value and the merits of the organization, the institutional presence of religion? But in order to provide that understanding, systematics will have to find a new handmaid, as it were, of theology, not just philosophy, but sociology, as Colleen was saying. Or even better, culture, that is the meaning dimension of social groups. This greater sociological awareness will address what I think is one of the greatest problems in Catholic theology in the Catholic Church, is how to get the message out. It seems to me that the Catholic tradition has enormous depth and richness in its tradition. The society has enormous demand, the lack of meaning and hope and so on. But how do we get supply and demand to intersect? We're not very good at it, is my impression. And I know I have Monsignor Sheehan here. I listened to your homilies in Harvard in the basement of the church, and you could hear a pin drop, because people were so hungry for it, and you communicated it so effectively. And we're not always successful at that, I think would be fair to say. So supply and demand, how do we make that intersect? And I think that problem is really just a symptom of a much deeper problem, and that is the mismatch between the structure of the church on the one hand. It's a pyramid. It has, one might say, not much transparency or accountability. It's a broadcast model based on authority. So there's a contradiction between the structure of the church on the one hand and the reality of the culture on the other, especially in light of a new social media, in which not just a tool we use, but that forms our consciousness in a way that it's flat structure, it's user-generated and shared content. It's not a broadcast model. It's a network model based on authenticity, not authority. The survival of the wittiest, as one of my students put it in his presentation. And this task, how do we A, be honest and bring to light this contradiction, and then how do we address it? I think there are many tools that practical theologians can help us address that issue. My time is up. Thank you for your attention.
So, questions? Yes, Teresa.
Thanks. This was really interesting. Thank you, Colleen, for getting us to stand up. I appreciate that all of you spoke within your disciplines, and perhaps that was the expectation. But when I was thinking about this, I was thinking about the school itself. And so the only one who spoke to the student audience was Brian. You spoke a little bit about the kind of background we're coming to expect. But anyone have thoughts on what you imagine theological education will look like in 10 years' time, given where we are now?
I think the answer is no, we don't. No. Please, somebody. Colin, go ahead.
Okay, sure. Okay, so it's a great question. One of the things that I do see is this fluidity with respect to the various areas that are named as specific, distinct areas in theology, a lot more crossing of those boundaries, which I do think is healthy. But I think theological education is going to be happening in places other than just the academy. Would love to see theological education happening more in our parishes and congregations in a more intentional way. I'm also imagining that theologians will also push themselves to enter into realms that are less familiar to them outside of the academy and do things like blog, et cetera, with respect to their theology and their message. So I sense that the contexts in which theological education will happen will not be limited simply to the university.
Yes, thanks for the question. Colleen mentioned blog. There's a Catholic moral theology blog that was started probably, well, at least 5 years ago, maybe longer than that. I don't frequent the blog. It's clearly an initiative of younger scholars in the field. So what's happening in the blogosphere are conversations that some of us older folks are not engaged with, although they are conversations and concerns that we have experienced in the what is common to our experience face-to-face with persons who are questioning what we have written or what we are predicting for the future, or how we have handled a particular situation. What I see in terms of the future, similar to what Brian was saying, that our students are different than my generation, clearly. And it's curious to see, I don't consider myself old, but it's curious to see that over the 30 years of my academic career, the changes in the student population, what the students come with, the questions that the students ask, and the resources that an attentive faculty member is going to access in order to respond ever more effectively to that student or those students. So they're not isolated concerns among them. So it's a challenge to keep on top of the discipline. So I have to be reading in both genres. I have to be reading in the tradition because there are certain things that qualify as moral theology. There are certain texts that you must at least have awareness of, if not have read some of it. You would not have a biblicist never referring to the Bible and expecting students to read the Bible. Same thing in moral theology. There are some texts that are the critical sources. Aquinas, Bonaventure, from the medieval period. Clearly, there are things earlier in the patristic literature that can be mined. There's the Didache. There's all these sorts of texts from the tradition, as well as what's happened in the 20th century, as I had spent time rehearsing in my earlier comments. So the students are somewhat reluctant to want to go there and to learn the way of reaching the modern student, the contemporary student, I should say, is challenging for us. So the next generation of education in moral theology is going to be ever more adept at communications technologies, as well as presenting material in ways that will invite the student to go to the sources in their original form.
I'd just like to ask Teresa, you teach this at youth and young adults. What are your thoughts? What do you think the kind of student will be in the next 10 years, over the next 10 years?
You identified my problem, which is that until we find a mental framework and a vocabulary
Wait for the mic.
in which to frame the message. We have a message. We have an incredibly valuable message. We have a huge, rich tradition, but we have a mental mindset in our society among not just our listeners, but our people in general, and they're Catholics, that doesn't see the need for it. I preach every Sunday to an increasingly small population. I don't think it's entirely my experience, but I do think that the need to identify the point of contact between the contemporary mindset, which goes back to theology and all the rest of it, and sociology, and the message that we have, is the critical task of theology in the next 10 years. If we don't do it, we'll be preaching tradition, but to people who don't have the slightest interest in it. And that, I worry about that hugely, both as a priest and as a preacher. That, not to prolong this, but an organization of which I serve as a chaplain was talking about how we need to reorganize the church. Well, I suppose we do. But I said, well, if we reorganize every church in the world, but it doesn't have a message that people want to hear, that people resonate with, it'll just be a museum. So, I really think you people, not I, I'm out of it now, but I think you people have an enormous task ahead of you. And if we don't get on with it, the benches will keep emptying and the people will keep being indifferent. 10 years ago, Ed O'Flaherty gave a paper in this room on religious indifference. He was a religious sociologist, and it never got published. He died some years ago, and it was critical, really, to analyzing the contemporary mindset. I keep thinking of it as I listen to you talk today. But anyway, I hope that was some answer. I didn't expect to be part of the panel.
Pick back up with Teresa for a minute. Great.
I think one of the questions that has to be dealt with is who funds theological education. Because historically, if you're going back long enough, those who are in theological education were in seminary settings or houses of formation, and nobody outside that. Right? Now, majority of the student body are lay people who are funding their education either on their own dime or at the generosity of a university like Boston College. And we have to kind of think about who do we invest in order to create a leadership within the church. And so I think the funding of, well, education more broadly, but theological education, I think, is going to somehow be part of the picture. So I'm focusing less on the student in the sense that you guys were asking. I'm focusing more on who can actually afford to come, and how do we create mechanisms by which it's possible for people who have an inclination or proclivity for this are able to come.
Anyone want to comment on each of those two, on Teresa's comment?
I would just point out that it's especially relevant in this area when we've seen two divinity schools or theologists more or less, I mean, not close, but really downsize, and we see theology departments across the country shrinking, reflecting demographics and liberal arts, broadly speaking. So I think that's a very, very valid question. Yeah. And we can sometimes sort of ignore it in fantasizing about the bright future or all the things that we are going to get done, and those real questions are very important. Yeah, thank you.
I think that also raises the question of that you had raised about who are we preparing people to be teaching to? Who are we preparing the theologians to be ministering to? And how we present it. Any comments?
Well, I was going to ask you, Jane, about your online. Well, I mean that's you reach people in their context, in their concrete situation. You can reach so many more people. I mean, maybe we would just put Michael Himes on a video and cut out the middle people like us and have a few doctoral students with the grades, and I mean, seriously, online.
Yeah, I do think to some extent that online, particularly as you had said, moving it out of the academy and into other settings, I think the online work is often a context in which that's done and can be done effectively. So yeah, I think that is one of them. Other questions? Yes, Barb.
Thanks so much for your comments. It was really interesting. My question is, where within the train of theological studies does the living tradition and academic discipline of spirituality fit in? Especially because I think that's often the doorway through which people are attracted to go in to understand more deeply the tradition of our faith. Mm-hmm. So where does it fit explicitly?
So I was actually going to mention the importance of the twinning of theology and spirituality, but I thought I'd be speaking too much. Here we are back again. But people have definite hungers of heart, and that's eternal. The hungers of the human heart are very real. And for as long as theology is communication of doctrines without any sense of the practices that gave rise to doctrines, the early Christians were interested in a lived way of faith. And that gave rise to a lot of thorny questions and, yes, Christological controversies and all the rest. But practices preceded doctrines, and doctrines, actually the best of them, will always point in the direction of practice as well. So in theological education, I think more incorporation of spiritual practice alongside of the doctrines of faith is absolutely essential in terms of addressing people's real hungers.
I find in biblical studies I think the challenge I face most often, and especially in the intro class, is students are afraid to engage in critical analysis of the Bible because they're afraid it might do some harm or it will be irreverent to deal with the Bible in this way. And so I find a lot of my own kind of pastoral sensibility coming through in class and wanting to preserve for students a sense of reverence for Scripture, but also being able to hold that together with a critical analysis of Scripture. And so I think getting students to, even as we're analyzing Scripture with critical methodologies, to always be maintaining a sense of reverence for Scripture as the Word of God, and also not maintaining a sort of spiritual mindset with Scripture, even as we're engaging in this critical analysis.
Mary Jo, do you have a comment?
So in just the past 2 years, I've begun the practice of starting each class with a prayer. I'm not the one to initiate the prayer. I set up a schedule, and the students sign up for a day and they will offer a prayer before them. We begin the class, and they can have the prayer being something that is a prayer that everyone knows, or it could be a meditation, it could be a passage from Scripture. It very often has turned into being a response to something that's happening contemporaneously. And in fact, the reason that I started this practice was the result of the horrible, violent incidents of racism in the United States over the past 2 years that have been broadcast widely, past 2 and 3 years. And I brought that to class. And then I asked the students to bring their concerns to class. Now, it's moral theology. If we're not talking about what's happening now, we're missing the purpose of learning how to apply the discipline of moral theology to critical subject matter to understand what's happening here, what can I do in response to this or that, good thing or bad thing. It's not always the bad thing, fortunately. It's not always a horror. It could be the first day of spring, for example. But it's always the question of moral theology is not this dead discipline. It's something that is responsive to what's happening in real people's real lives. And to bring a theological reflection to that is the way that, at least in the past 3 years, I have been very conscious and deliberate about inviting the students to think more deliberately and through a theological lens about what's going on in our world.
Thank you.
To address that question concretely, I think maybe in 10 years from now, the biggest reflection will be on the success of our recently begun spirituality program. So Colleen could speak directly to that. And I think one of the struggles we've had as a faculty is determining not so much what counts as spirituality, but what doesn't, because it so much informs, I think, what we do. And obviously, ancient Aramaic isn't going to get you credit, but nevertheless, maybe it should. But it does show the kind of pervasive presence, to use a clumsy, maybe even a pun, of the Spirit in everything we're doing with spirituality. Yeah.
Another question. Yep, Tom, and in the back.
I want to go back for a moment to the comments that Father here in the front row made, the challenge of effectively representing our faith into a contemporary consciousness, which of course basically proves the point that the most important subdiscipline of theology is religious education, which this is not a self-serving comment, clearly. But unless we can communicate it effectively, obviously, what good is all our theology? But I want to go back to, I think it was Dominic's, if I understand him correctly, his closing comment, which in a sense implied that this rich faith that we have, that the world is desperately in need of, that we have a structure, we have an ecclesial structure that is no longer capable of communicating it effectively or credibly into the present situation, and that where do we go with that? I mean, in many ways, it's the last surviving monarchy in the Western world. The inadequacy, I think, of the church's structures to address the clergy sex abuse issue problem has, in a sense, writ large the ineptitude of and the ineffectiveness of the structures at this point in time. Structures that may have served well at another time and place, but are not serving as well now. Where do we go with that? How do we attempt to reform that? I'd love to hear the panel's comment.
So, who'd like to start that one?
Well, I mean, our previous boss, Mark Massa, in his inaugural sort of job talk lecture, talked about there are two types of religion that thrive in America, at least, and that's either the Mormons or the bricks and mortar Catholicism of the ghetto, where you went to school, a Catholic school with Catholic neighbors and married a Catholic and sent your kids to Catholic school. And those sociological conditions don't exist anymore. The Mormons might have them, but we don't. The only other model that's actually increasing in numbers are the evangelicals, where it's this low, flat structure, entrepreneurial spirit, very grounded on the Bible, and it has this appeal of authenticity because it's not sort of receiving orders or, So that evangelical model he suggested tends to be nurtured best in religious orders in terms of that charism of the founder. That was his response as someone who studied a lot of sociology of religion. So I don't have any answers, but I think a Lutheran would say lots of the close proximity to the study of the Bible and being open to new forms that we hadn't thought could emerge, is being open to surprises, I think, would be one example. I think there's difficulty I think there are so many great things about the tradition of the past. I mean, from your upbringing in Ireland, and I think of my father, his upbringing in Ireland, I mean, there was a real solidity and presence. It's like James Joyce in Dubliners on a Sunday morning going to church saying, "Here comes everyone." And there was just a sense of this belonging, which I think a previous generation had, and that those conditions don't exist anymore. So whatever is to come is going to be quite different. And I don't think we can necessarily predict in advance what that will be, but we can set in place procedures for discerning what that will be. And I think the spiritual encounter, spiritual reading of the Bible will be at the heart of that renewal, whatever form it may take.
Spirit. Okay, I think you had your hand up, and then one more after that. Go ahead.
Thanks, everyone. I wondered about the role of continuing education. I mean, we're all here tonight to try and learn more about a field that we're already in. And I wonder the role of professional development, of practitioners learning to get better at their practice, teachers learning to get better at their practice. If you could speak at all about how we might think more about continuing our own education as we move forward, and how that might keep not just the boat afloat, but learn how to sail a little bit better.
Should I go ahead and I'll take a director of continuing education. They probably should. I think it's one of the most exciting aspects of theological education, and that the role of how. That's one of the ways I think that the School of Theology and Ministry will continue to grow, is in how we reach out beyond the walls of the STM, and one of the ways we do that is through our continuing education, through the department and the work that we do. These gatherings, which every year we have thousands of people participating in these kinds of events, and the encore that I announce at every event, those are really well used videos that get a good deal of circulation from the Google Analytics indicate that their use is much stronger than I thought they were. And I think that more and more needing to provide the opportunity for people to learn about their faith, but more importantly, from my perspective, to talk about their faith with other educated adults, or with other seeking adults, is a key aspect that needs to take place, that is sorely lacking in our church in many ways. That the opportunity for people to gather to reflect together on what it means to live as a Christian in the world today is crucial, whether their work is specifically in church-related work or not. That all these disciplines need to be and can be and are translated into made accessible, not dumbed down, but simply made accessible to people who don't come with master's degrees or advanced degrees. So I do think it's a real value. I think particularly, and this is, I think more and more we need to figure out how to reach out to the people who are teaching in our colleges and high schools, particularly in our high schools and grammar schools, as well as our ministers in our parishes, that they continue as well to be nourished by the tradition. Because I think that's often a lacuna in our offerings.
And I think also we had some conversation on our faculty meeting about certificate programs and the development of certificate programs, not just at our school, but at the university at large. And so I think people at our school and the university are thinking creatively about how to package courses in non-degree ways that can be taken by folks before a degree, during a degree, or after a degree as part of ongoing education. And what's especially exciting about that, I think, is a lot of these certificate programs have an interdisciplinary thrust to them. So it's not just theology, but Colleen and I just had a meeting a few weeks ago with a faculty member from Women and Gender Studies about a certificate program that could be developed in that direction. And so I think there's stuff coming down the pipeline that would be exciting in that area.
And the STM is offering a 18 credit freestanding certificate in spirituality studies, which begins next year. And we're hoping that attracts lots of folks who want to move more deeply into their faith.
Okay, I'm aware of time, and we begin on time and end on time, and so I'm aware of our time. First of all, thank you very much to the panels for their comments.